Tonight, we're doing something oddly intimate. We're diving into the weird, wonderful, and occasionally itchy world of medieval sleep. But before you pull up a blanket made of digital pixels, dim the lights, and settle in with your favorite tea or tallow candle, remember to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes if this kind of sleepy storytelling helps you unwind. We travel deep into the creaky corners of history. So if medieval lice, ghosts, and bedtime rituals are your lullaby, we're glad to have you here. Let's begin. Forget melatonin gummies, blackout curtains, or sleep tracking apps. In the Middle Ages, none of that existed, and yet people still slept, just not the way we do. Before electricity transformed the world into a 24-hour cycle of artificial daylight, sleep followed a different rhythm, one that included a scheduled midnight intermission. This pattern was called segmented sleep, a two-phase cycle where people would fall asleep shortly after sunset, slumber for about 4 hours, wake up around midnight, and then remain awake for a while before drifting into a second sleep until dawn. That waking period, sometimes called the watch, wasn't some weird form of insomnia. It was expected. It was even planned. During this quiet hour or two, people would stoke the fire, say their prayers, inspect the livestock, and in many cases, engage in conversation or intimacy. Medieval medical texts even recommended this post-first sleep period for conceiving children, as the body was believed to be rested and harmonious. Romance, apparently, peaked somewhere between goat patrol and psalm recitation. By sunrise, most people would have returned to their second sleep, wrapping up their rest in time for morning chores, church bells, or, if you were unlucky, plowing frozen mud fields. This entire structure, segmented sleep, was deeply ingrained in medieval culture. Monks lived by it. Farmers expected it. Even authors, like Chaucer, mentioned it casually, as though everyone would obviously understand that the night was made for 2 sleeps with a spiritual sandwich in between. And here's the twist. Modern sleep scientists think our ancestors may have been onto something. Studies have shown that without artificial light, the human brain naturally falls into a biphasic sleep pattern, with a wakeful pause in the middle. So, the next time you wake up at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering if your circadian rhythm is broken, you might just be channeling your inner 12th century baker, minus the rats and open hearths. And that's just the beginning. Because while the sleep schedule was strange, the beds people slept on, even stranger. In Part 2, we'll explore what medieval folks actually slept on. From straw piles and beetle-infested cloth sacks, to the luxurious, inheritance-worthy beds of nobles. Hint: even the rich weren't safe from itchy surprises. Stay cozy, this gets weird fast. Let's talk about where medieval people laid their heads. Spoiler alert, it wasn't on orthopedic pillows or memory foam. For most, a bed was more of a suggestion than a solution. If you were a peasant, which, let's be honest, most people were, your bed was usually a humble creation called a pallet. Picture a rough cloth sack filled with straw or hay. Now take away the sack. That's right, sometimes it was just loose straw on a dirt floor, shared with siblings, parents, and maybe a few chickens who hadn't yet figured out bedtime boundaries. These straw pallets weren't exactly luxury. They were lumpy, itchy, and excellent at harboring life forms you didn't invite: fleas, lice, mice, and more. But straw was cheap, insulating, and everywhere. It offered at least the illusion of comfort during long, cold nights. If you were lucky enough to elevate your pallet on a wooden frame, you at least reduced the risk of rolling over onto a beetle slightly. Now, if you had a bit more money, say you were a merchant or a well-fed miller, your bed might be raised off the ground and stuffed with feathers instead of straw. Sounds better, right? Until you realize feather mattresses still lacked sheets and often smelled faintly of whatever bird donated them. Also, feather beds were heirlooms. You didn't just buy one, you inherited Aunt Hild's mysteriously stained feather bed, like a generational curse, passed down with love and allergens. As for linens, forget it. Sheets were expensive. Laundry was an ordeal, involving boiling water, ash soap, and more back pain than you could afford. Most people slept in the same clothes they wore all day, rolling into bed, fully dressed and occasionally muddy. Nightwear, as we know it, matching pajama sets, or even nightgowns, wasn't common for most. You wore your day tunic, a shift if you were lucky, or nothing at all if you preferred to shiver in silence. And then there's personal space, or the lack of it. The idea of sleeping alone was foreign and borderline suspicious. Families often slept in the same room or even the same bed. Children, parents, grandparents, and whoever else was around might all squeeze together like sardines, itchy, unwashed sardines. Privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was non-existent. Nobles, of course, had it better. Their beds were large, ornately carved wooden frames topped with feather mattresses, embroidered canopies, and thick, draft-blocking curtains. These weren't just sleeping spaces, they were status symbols. Some were so valuable, they were listed in wills. You might not inherit land, but you'd get Cousin Ethel's majestic bed, lice and all. But even noble sleep wasn't peaceful. The same bugs found their way into even the finest feather beds. So did servants, lapdogs, and occasionally a court jester who'd had too much ale. Sleep was communal, chaotic, and a battle against the cold, noise, and crawling things. In the next part, we'll explore the original nightcap, and no, it's not a drink, it's a hat, and it was essential for not freezing your ears off. So, let's set the scene. You're finally curled up on your straw pallet or feather-stuffed relic of an ancestral mattress. You've dodged the mice, swatted a few fleas, and accepted that you'll be sharing your sleep with your cousin, a goat, and possibly a toddler who won't stop snoring. But before you drift off, there's one crucial piece of sleepwear you cannot forget: the medieval nightcap. And no, not the cozy dram of whiskey by the hearth. This was literal fabric headgear. The medieval nightcap was a wardrobe essential, and not just for style. Medieval homes were cold. Stone walls and thatched roofs let in more wind than they kept out. Windows, if you had them, were made of thin animal horn or waxed parchment. Glass was rare and expensive. Heating, unless you counted the family pig, you were on your own. So naturally, medieval people took action to keep the most important part of their anatomy warm: their heads. These nightcaps came in all forms, short and round, long and pointy, some shaped like floppy wizard hats, others like a deflated mushroom. Wool, linen, or scraps from old garments made up the material. If you were poor, it might be just a strip of cloth tied around your head. If you were wealthy, it could be embroidered and dyed, a quiet flex as you snuggled into bed with prestige on your scalp. For men, the nightcap was functional: warmth first, fashion never. For women, it often doubled as a coif, a kind of head wrap that preserved modesty and kept your hair in check. Some traditions expected married women to keep their heads covered even while asleep. So the nightcap wasn't just about temperature, it was also about social status and propriety. And there was etiquette, too. Wearing your nightcap outside the bedroom, say, when answering the door late at night, was the polite way to signal you were off duty. It was a silent message. I'm not decent, I'm not available, and I really don't want to talk about taxes right now. These caps were often paired with a nightshirt, long, loose tunics that looked like oversized potato sacks. Think Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the haunting spirits. Sleepwear was never about seduction. It was about function, friction, and surviving the night without catching a draft to the spleen. And, lest we forget, modesty wasn't the only concern. The more fabric you wore to bed, the less exposed skin for pests to bite. Nightcaps and nightshirts doubled as a bug barrier, a medieval solution to the eternal problem of things crawling where they shouldn't. In short, if you ever thought a sleeping hat was silly, remember, medieval folks wore them not to be cute, but to avoid frostbite and spiritual judgment. In the next part, we'll turn to inns, where you might share a bed not with your family, but with total strangers, because in medieval travel, a bed for the night often meant just that, one single bed. Imagine you're a medieval traveler. Maybe you're a merchant, a pilgrim, or just a tired soul whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. It's dark, it's raining, and you need a place to sleep. Good news, you find an inn. Better news, they have space. Bad news, space doesn't mean your own room. It doesn't even mean your own bed. It means you're climbing into a half-occupied mattress with strangers, and you better hope they don't snore, talk in their sleep, or carry anything contagious. Medieval inns weren't the cozy, timber-framed sanctuaries you see in fantasy novels. Most were glorified bunkhouses, crowded, loud, and utterly devoid of privacy. If you wanted to sleep indoors, you got what was available. And what was available was usually a bed that had already seen at least 2 occupants that evening. Beds were shared not just out of necessity, but because they were expensive to maintain. Mattresses were rare commodities, and space was always at a premium. Inns charged by the bed, not the person. And it wasn't uncommon to find yourself sandwiched between a blacksmith and a monk who mumbled Latin in his sleep. You weren't expected to make conversation. You were expected to shut your eyes and pretend this was normal, because it was. In larger towns, inns might have long communal halls filled with rows of beds or pallets, resembling a slumber party hosted by people who had never met and didn't necessarily want to. Snoring contests were unregulated. Elbow territory was fiercely protected. If you rolled the wrong way, you might accidentally spoon someone's sword or their squire. There were no pillows embroidered with your name, no fresh linens or mints on the straw, and hygiene. Best not to think too hard about it. Bedbugs were often regular guests, so were fleas, rats, and the occasional chicken that wandered in looking for warmth. If you were concerned about theft, and you should have been, you tied your purse to your belt, stuffed it under your shirt, or used your bag as a pillow. Some people even slept on top of their belongings, just in case someone got curious during the night. Luggage, in this case, doubled as both cushion and early warning system. Of course, this sort of arrangement wasn't for everyone. The wealthy rarely endured it. Nobles traveled with entourages and expected, no, demanded, private rooms. If an innkeeper valued their livelihood, they found a separate chamber, even if it meant kicking someone else out. But for common folk, a shared bed was better than the alternative, sleeping outside. Out there, you risked wolves, robbers, rain, and the occasional overly affectionate badger. Inside the inn, Your worst problem was that the guy next to you thought garlic cured all ailments and bathed exclusively on St. Swithin's Day. How going to bed wasn't just about sleep, it was also about saving your soul. Because in medieval times, a proper night's prayer could mean the difference between heavenly rest and eternal consequences. As night crept over the medieval countryside and the fires burned low, slipping into bed wasn't just about sleep, it was a spiritual affair. For many, lying down to rest was a symbolic surrender of the body and a gamble of the soul. Death was never far in the medieval world. Disease, fire, raids, or just the cruel hand of fate could strike between one breath and the next. So, each night, people prepared themselves as if they might not wake up. And for some, they didn't. Before sleep, prayers weren't whispered luxuriously. They were urgent, specific, and rehearsed. Children learned them before they could read. Adults had personalized versions memorized for every possible threat, illness, demons, pestilence, and those unexplained knocks on the cottage wall at midnight. A popular verse, now softened into a nursery rhyme, had a darker purpose. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Innocent words, maybe, but in the medieval world, they weren't poetic, were protocol. This nightly ritual wasn't about calmness, it was about preparedness. People confessed sins, asked for forgiveness, and called on saints like Saint Michael or Saint Benedict to guard them while they slept. Some would even sprinkle holy water on their beds or carve protective crosses into their bedposts. A good night's sleep meant going to bed with a cleansed soul and your spiritual affairs in order. For monks and nuns, bedtime prayers were even more structured. The final service of the day, called Compline, marked the end of activity and the beginning of silence. After Compline, talking was forbidden, not because someone might be tired, but because silence itself was sacred. Even a whispered joke or a loud yawn could bring down punishment. The idea was that in silence, one might better hear the voice of God, or at least stop inviting trouble. Children were included in these rituals, not just for their soul's sake, but to keep them from mischief. Tales of angels watching them were less comforting and more cautionary. These weren't cute cherubs with harps. These were ever-vigilant celestial witnesses who might report bad behavior straight to heaven's accounting department. The fear of dying in your sleep wasn't unfounded. Sudden death, whether from plague, accident, or mysterious affliction, was part of life. So was the fear of what might happen to an unrepentant soul in the dark. That creaking door, the cold breeze, the shadow in the corner, everything took on meaning, and often that meaning wasn't good. This nightly terror wasn't limited to peasants. Nobles prayed just as fiercely, if not more so. After all, they had more sins to confess, more enemies, more secrets, and more to lose. Everyone, regardless of rank, faced the same night and the same fears. Next, we'll slip into the strange, symbolic world of medieval dreams. Because what you saw while you slept could say more about your soul than anything you did while awake. And no, dreaming about juggling goats might not be as harmless as it sounds. In the medieval imagination, dreams weren't random brain static or whimsical nonsense. They were divine messages, spiritual warnings, or, occasionally, evidence of demonic interference. A dream wasn't something you brushed off over breakfast. It was something you analyzed, confessed, or, in some cases, fasted over. Because to sleep was to risk opening the gates not only to rest, but to something far more mysterious, the unseen world of the soul. If you dreamt of fire, it might mean damnation, water, purity, or drowning, depending on the clarity. A bird in your dream could symbolize the Holy Spirit, or, alternatively, an omen of death. It all depended on context, timing, and whether or not you'd eaten bad mutton before bed. Monks, theologians, and chronic dreamers spent hours parsing these nocturnal messages. Entire books were written on dream interpretation, many borrowing from older Greek and Roman traditions, but draped in thick layers of medieval spirituality. Some people kept dream journals, often with the same reverence modern mystics reserve for tarot readings. Monks might record a vision of angels bearing torches, or demons whispering temptations, and these accounts were taken seriously, sometimes even seen as small revelations. Others, less fortunate, woke from dreams of sin, despairing that their subconscious had revealed a fault in their soul. A dream of theft might mean you harbored greed. A dream of desire might send you straight to confession. And if you thought it was safe to dream about bread or dancing or floating gently across a meadow, think again. The devil, according to some medieval texts, was especially fond of manipulating dreams to sneak sin past your defenses. Your actions while dreaming, though unintentional, were often viewed as moral reflections of your true character. Even an impure dream could weigh on your conscience the next morning. In literature, dreams were also powerful narrative tools. Poets and authors, from Chaucer to lesser-known scribes, crafted elaborate dream sequences in their stories. These dreams often carried the main character into allegorical lands where animals talked, sins wore robes, and trees dispensed unsolicited moral advice. Dreams weren't escapism, they were lessons disguised in moonlight. But it wasn't all gloom. Occasionally, a dream might bring comfort, a visitation from a deceased loved one, or a vision of heaven's light. These were cherished and shared in hushed voices by firelight. Families, especially in rural communities, might gather around and interpret someone's dream together, trying to divine its meaning like some sacred group project. Yet fear always hovered. What if the dream wasn't divine, but dangerous? What if it was a warning you didn't understand? Or worse, what if your dream was so disturbing, so blasphemous, that it needed to be confessed before your next breath? In the medieval mind, dreaming wasn't just sleeping, it was spiritual exposure. Soon we'll explore how sleeping beside animals, yes, actual livestock, was not only common, but considered a clever way to keep warm. Because when the temperature dropped and your mattress rustled with fleas, a pig might be the best sleep aid around. In the modern world, we think of letting pets sleep in the bed as a cute, cozy, slightly smelly personal choice. In the medieval world, it was pure survival. The family dog, the cat, the chicken, even the pig, all were welcome in the sleeping space, not for companionship, but for body heat. Because medieval houses, especially those of peasants, weren't just cold, they were practically indoor weather systems. Picture this: one single-room dwelling, with walls of stone or wattle and daub, no insulation, and a thatched roof that may or may not leak, depending on the mood of the sky. There's a central hearth, but unless you're sitting directly next to it, that fire is more ambience than warmth. At night, when temperatures dropped and frost crept into your bones, the best source of heat wasn't a blanket, it was something alive and breathing. Families would gather together, not just with each other, but with their animals. Dogs would curl up at the foot of the bed. Chickens might nest in the corner. Pigs, cows and goats were sometimes kept in the same building entirely, sectioned off by little more than a wooden barrier or wishful thinking. It wasn't weird, It wasn't unsanitary. It was expected. A large animal in the room meant fewer frozen fingers and toes come morning. Children were tucked in between adults, dogs at their feet, and perhaps a goose honking softly nearby. It was cramped, noisy, smelly, but it worked. The livestock didn't mind the company, and most medieval folk didn't question the arrangement. They simply adapted. For wealthier households, it was slightly different. Nobles didn't usually bunk with pigs, but that didn't mean they slept in pristine peace. Lapdogs were popular among the elite, and these pampered animals often nestled right into the featherbeds, bringing with them fleas, ticks, and an aristocratic disdain for boundaries. In some castles, favored animals even had designated sleeping areas or their own miniature chambers, not out of necessity, but because status extended to pets as well. Of course, there were drawbacks. Animals snored. They got up at inconvenient times. They sometimes mistook your blanket for grass. But the alternative, sleeping alone in a drafty room with nothing but a lice-infested cap for warmth, made sharing with a sheepdog seem perfectly reasonable. This practice also added to the layered noise of the medieval night: grunting pigs, rustling hay, creaking floors, coughing relatives, and barking dogs, all mingling with the wind howling through the gaps in the walls. It was not a quiet night, but it was life and sleep, medieval style, warm, noisy, and always shared. Next, we'll climb into the austere, uncomfortable world of monastic dormitories, where silence was sacred, softness was sinful, and sleep was just one more thing to be endured with holy discipline. Now, imagine trading your straw mattress, noisy pig, and snoring uncle for something even more extreme: the monastic dormitory. If sleeping in a cold room with your relatives was challenging, sleeping in a monastery was its own spiritual boot camp. Comfort wasn't the goal, sanctity was, and sleep, like everything else in monastic life, was strictly regulated, sparse, and unrelentingly silent. Monks didn't just go to bed. They retired from the world. Their dormitories were vast stone rooms, lined with narrow beds or wooden planks, usually arranged in tidy rows, like obedient soldiers for Christ. Some monasteries didn't even provide individual beds, just spaces along a bench or floor. The goal wasn't restfulness, it was resistance. Sleeping, after all, was a chance for sin to creep in, laziness, dreams, and even temptation. So the body had to be restrained, even in sleep. Monks wore their habits to bed: robes, belts, and sometimes sandals. Not because it was efficient, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. was more painful than enduring the night fully clothed. Their garments were stiff, heavy, and often itchy, but they served as spiritual armor, a constant reminder that even during sleep, discipline must prevail. There were no pillows, no curtains, no soft whispers. Silence wasn't suggested, it was enforced. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic orders, demanded that dormitories remain completely quiet. If someone groaned, rolled too loudly, or, heaven forbid, laughed, they risked being assigned unpleasant tasks like chamberpot duty. Snoring was tolerated, though only because it couldn't be helped. If it became disruptive, it was viewed as a burden for the community to bear, not a personal failing. Lighting was minimal, usually just one candle for the entire room. There was no need to see. You were expected to lie still, keep your thoughts pure, and offer up your rest to God. Even dreaming was treated with suspicion. Some orders encouraged monks to sleep sitting up to prevent dreams altogether. Yes, sitting up, sometimes on benches, sometimes propped against walls. That way, you couldn't sink into indulgent slumber. You were resting, but not enjoying it. Sleep was seen not as pleasure, but preparation. Each night's sleep trained the soul for its eventual departure from the body. Denying the flesh, even its most basic comforts, was viewed as a path toward holiness. Rest was granted, but always with restraint. You weren't supposed to like it. Despite the harshness, monks believed that this sacrifice brought them closer to God. The cold, the silence, the rigidity, all of it was part of a sacred rhythm. And over time, the body adjusted. The snoring of 40 robed brethren became white noise. The stiff robes became familiar. Even the stone beneath you became, in a strange way, a kind of home. But the sleep wasn't uninterrupted. Monks woke in the middle of the night, not from discomfort, but on purpose, because sleep had to make room for something more important, midnight prayer. And in the next scene, we'll rise with them, in the dark, in the cold, in total silence, to witness one of the strangest alarm calls in history. Now, imagine trading your straw mattress, noisy pig, and snoring uncle for something even more extreme, the monastic dormitory. If sleeping in a cold room with your relatives was challenging, sleeping in a monastery was its own spiritual boot camp. Comfort wasn't the goal. Sanctity was unsleep. Like everything else in monastic life, was strictly regulated, sparse, and unrelentingly silent. Monks didn't just go to bed. They retired from the world. Their dormitories were vast stone rooms, lined with narrow beds or wooden planks, usually arranged in tidy rows, like obedient soldiers for Christ. Some monasteries didn't even provide individual beds, just spaces along a bench or floor. The goal wasn't restfulness, it was resistance. Sleeping, after all, was a chance for sin to creep in, laziness, dreams, and even temptation. So the body had to be restrained, even in sleep. Monks wore their habits to bed, robes, belts, and sometimes sandals. Not because it was efficient, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. was more painful than enduring the night fully clothed. Their garments were stiff, heavy, and often itchy, but they served as spiritual armor, a constant reminder that even during sleep, discipline must prevail. There were no pillows, no curtains, no soft whispers. Silence wasn't suggested, it was enforced. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many monastic orders, demanded that dormitories remain completely quiet. If someone groaned, rolled too loudly, or, heaven forbid, laughed, they risked being assigned unpleasant tasks, like chamber pot duty. Snoring was tolerated, though only because it couldn't be helped. If it became disruptive, it was viewed as a burden for the community to bear, not a personal failing. Lighting was minimal, usually just one candle for the entire room. There was no need to see. You were expected to lie still, keep your thoughts pure, and offer up your rest to God. Even dreaming was treated with suspicion. Some orders encouraged monks to sleep sitting up, to prevent dreams altogether. Yes, sitting up, sometimes on benches, sometimes propped against walls. That way, you couldn't sink into indulgent slumber. You were resting, but not enjoying it. Sleep was seen not as pleasure, but preparation. Each night's sleep trained the soul for its eventual departure from the body. Denying the flesh, even its most basic comforts, was viewed as a path toward holiness. Rest was granted, but always with restraint. You weren't supposed to like it. Despite the harshness, monks believed that this sacrifice brought them closer to God. The cold, the silence, the rigidity, all of it was part of a sacred rhythm. And over time, the body adjusted. The snoring of 40 robed brethren became white noise. The stiff robes became familiar. Even the stone beneath you became, in a strange way, a kind of home. But the sleep wasn't uninterrupted. Monks woke in the middle of the night, not from discomfort, but on purpose, because sleep had to make room for something more important: midnight prayer. And in the next scene, we'll rise with them, in the dark, in the cold, in total silence, to witness one of the strangest alarm calls in history. The bell tolls. It's the darkest hour of the night, long before dawn even considers breaking the horizon. While the rest of the medieval world snores beside goats and hearths, monks are already stirring. This is the hour of matins, the first and perhaps most punishing of the canonical prayers. In monasteries across Europe, dozens of sleep-deprived men rise from their hard planks or sit upright from half-sleep, still wrapped in wool and willpower, summoned by the call of God and a very loud bell. The ritual is exact. No yawning, no muttering, no rubbing your eyes. You rise in silence, as your brothers do, forming a quiet procession in the dim candlelight. The only sound is the shuffle of sandals on cold stone and the occasional creak of an old knee. You move from dormitory to chapel, cloaked in darkness, breath visible in the cold. The chapel is freezing, vast and echoing, a place built for humility, not warmth. There, under the flicker of sparse candle flames, the monks chant psalms, read scripture, and offer prayers. This isn't a brief devotional. Matins can last for an hour or longer, depending on the order and the season. Some enthusiastic monasteries even stretched the service toward 2 hours, believing more was more when it came to divine praise. Sleep, after all, could wait. Salvation could not. Monks stand, kneel, and chant in Latin, not because they all understand it, but because that's how it's always been done. Their voices rise in haunting unison, reverberating off stone and wood, a sound meant to reach heaven, or at least the top of the rafters. Falling asleep during the service, it happened. But if you nodded off mid-psalm, you might be asked to take on more prayers as penance, or worse, be assigned to latrine duty for a week. Some orders were stricter than others. In the most ascetic monasteries, sleep was fragmented and precious. 2 or 3 hours before matins, maybe 2 more afterward if you were lucky. Other communities, especially in colder climates, allowed a little flexibility, but the structure remained. Night was not solely for sleeping. It was also for service, humility, and discipline. After matins, the schedule varied. Some monks returned to their beds for a second sleep. Others moved straight into early study, labor, or more prayer, depending on their rule. There was no lingering, no curling back under a blanket. Every hour had a purpose. Every action was accounted for. To modern minds, this sounds unbearable. But for monks, it was the path to heaven, a nightly offering of their time, energy, and physical comfort to something greater than themselves. A cold, silent chapel at 3 a.m. wasn't just a burden, it was sacred. Next, we turn to the strange social suspicion around sleeping alone. Because in medieval times, curling up solo in your own bed wasn't a luxury, it was a warning sign. And in some communities, it was treated as punishment. In today's world, sleeping alone is often viewed as a luxury, a king-sized mattress, no snoring, no one stealing the blanket. Solitude is peace. But in the medieval world, sleeping alone was deeply strange. It wasn't a sign of status or serenity. It was, at best, impractical, and, at worst, suspicious. Because warmth wasn't optional, and neither was company. Let's start with the basics. Heat. Medieval homes bled cold like a sieve. Stone walls, thatched roofs, and gaps in construction made even summer nights drafty. A bed alone wasn't a cozy retreat. It was a frigid trap. Families, especially those of modest means, slept together out of necessity. Parents, children, visiting cousins, even neighbors might share a sleeping space. It wasn't about bonding. It was about body heat. But beyond comfort, there was something spiritual in this arrangement. Alone in the dark, medieval people believed your soul was vulnerable. Demons, spirits, temptations, all were believed to creep more easily into solitary sleep. Sharing a bed was a kind of moral insulation. If something happened, if you mumbled in your sleep, thrashed, or uttered a curse, someone would witness it, someone could stop it, or at the very least, someone else would be possessed first. Children were never expected to sleep alone. It wasn't just fear of cold, it was fear of what might be lurking. Medieval folklore is brimming with tales of fairies snatching children from their beds, of ghosts whispering to lonely sleepers, and of wicked spirits drawn to unattended souls. A child sleeping by themselves was vulnerable, not just to night terrors, but to real ones, or so the stories warned. Even married couples rarely had privacy. It was normal for children to sleep in the same room, or even the same bed. Servants might sleep in the corner. Guests might crash at the foot of the bed. The concept of a private, locked bedroom was reserved for the ultra-rich, and even they didn't always use it. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a foreign concept. In religious communities, sleeping alone could be a punishment. Monks assigned solitary sleep were often under discipline. The belief was clear. Isolation led to temptation, and temptation led to sin. Being alone in bed wasn't rest. It was spiritual risk. And then there was the social aspect. If a person routinely chose to sleep alone, eyebrows were raised. Were they hiding something? Were they too proud to share? In close-knit villages and towns, everyone noticed, and no one forgot. Of course, there were exceptions. Nobles and high clergy sometimes had their own rooms, but even then, they might keep a dog or servant nearby, just in case. So the next time you stretch out alone in your bed, enjoying the silence and space, remember, in the medieval world, that kind of sleep was reserved for the suspicious, the punished, or the spiritually vulnerable. And in the next scene, we'll explore the strangest of all sleep styles, the upright sleeper, because lying flat, that was a little too close to death for comfort. Sleeping sitting up might sound like something you do accidentally during a boring lecture or on a particularly bumpy bus ride. But in the Middle Ages, some people did it on purpose, not because they were uncomfortable lying down, but because they believed sleeping flat was dangerous. Not in the bad for your back kind of way, dangerous in a more eternal sense. One widespread belief was that lying flat mimicked the posture of the dead. Corpses were laid out that way, arms folded or at their sides, eyes closed, ready for burial, sleeping in the same position. It felt like an invitation. Better not confuse the angels, or worse, draw the attention of death itself. Upright sleepers avoided the full horizontal pose, not for comfort, but to avoid being mistaken for someone ready to cross into the afterlife. But there were practical reasons too, or at least what passed for practicality in medieval medicine. According to the dominant theory of the time, The human body was governed by humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sleeping flat was believed to cause an imbalance, letting phlegm pool in the head or lungs. Doctors advised people to sleep partially upright to promote better digestion and prevent congestion of the brain, which sounds dramatic, but in their minds was just good preventative medicine. The wealthy, who could afford fancy feather beds and the space to configure them creatively, often had angled supports or bolsters to prop themselves up slightly during sleep. They'd lean against headboards or stuffed pillows under their backs and necks. Some beds were even built with reclining features, early medieval recliners, designed to hold the sleeper in a semi-seated position. Think of it as a medieval lazyboy with lice. Monks and religious ascetics took it further. In some stricter orders, they were required to sleep upright or seated, not just to avoid sin, but to suppress dreams altogether. Dreams, after all, could be temptations in disguise. Lust, pride, gluttony, all could sneak into the mind through dream visions. Sleeping upright reduced the likelihood of deep sleep and therefore reduced the risk of dreaming. Uncomfortable, absolutely, but spiritually safer. In some communities, especially among the devout, people would even sleep on benches or against stone walls, arms crossed or hands folded, not in pursuit of a good night's rest, but as a form of devotional discomfort. It was about reminding the body that comfort wasn't the goal. Salvation was. Naturally, this wasn't widespread. Most peasants couldn't afford to prop themselves up or cared little for posture when they'd spent all day plowing frozen fields. But among those with religious or medical concerns, and those with the means to choose, upright sleep was a thing. A stiff, silent, and probably sleepless thing. Next, we descend into a topic that every medieval sleeper knew far too well: pests, fleas, lice, and the infamous bedbug, not symbols of poor hygiene, but roommates no one could evict. Once the candle flickered out and the room settled into darkness, the medieval sleeper braced for a nightly ritual far less peaceful than prayer or dreams: the war with pests. Forget scented pillow sprays or down comforters. Medieval beds were battlegrounds, and the enemy came with 6 legs, tiny fangs, and an unholy sense of timing. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't occasional nuisances. They were permanent residents, and they never paid rent. Let's start with the basics. Hygiene standards in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high. Baths were rare, especially in colder climates. Laundry was labor-intensive and often reserved for outer garments only. Underclothes were reused until they walked themselves to the washtub and mattresses. They weren't cleaned, ever, whether made of straw, feathers, or wool. These sleeping surfaces were prime real estate for vermin. A hay-stuffed sack on a wood frame might seem harmless, until it started rustling under its own power. Lice were so common that they became symbols in art and literature, metaphors for sin, shame, or sometimes twisted affection. Rich or poor, clean or not, no one was spared. In noble households, it wasn't unusual to employ a nitpicker, a servant whose entire job was to comb through hair and linens in search of these tiny invaders. Yes, the term comes from a very real, very itchy job. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the stealthy predators of the medieval bedroom. They hid in cracks between boards, inside mattress seams, and even behind wall hangings. By day, invisible. By night, insatiable. Their bites left welts, rashes, and sometimes infections. But worse than the physical discomfort was the mental toll, the knowledge that every night Your body became an all-you-can-eat buffet for things smaller than a grain of rice. Then there were fleas, which didn't just bite, but also carried disease. You might have heard of one particular outbreak they helped spread, the Black Death. While rats get most of the blame, it was fleas that ferried plague bacteria from host to host, including those nestled snugly in your feather mattress. Sleep, in this context, was not restful. It was risky. People fought back the only ways they knew how. Some stuffed herbs like wormwood, tansy, or lavender into their bedding in hopes the strong smells would repel bugs. Others sprinkled ashes or garlic around their beds, or slept fully clothed, tucked head to toe to reduce bite access. In extreme cases, people burned old bedding entirely and started fresh, though fresh usually meant another sack of straw, not a sanitized memory foam mattress. Even poets wrote about fleas. John Donne famously turned one into a symbol of romantic union, which tells you how normalized these pests were. When a bug biting to people in bed is a metaphor for love, you know something's gone deeply, irrevocably medieval. Next, we turn to an even stranger practice, sleeping in armor. Because when the world outside your castle walls was hostile, and danger waited behind every shadow, some medieval warriors chose to rest with their chainmail still on, dreaming, clanking, and sweating in the name of survival. For most of us, falling asleep in jeans is uncomfortable enough. Now imagine trying to get some shut-eye in 100 pounds of iron, clanking, creaking, and coated in sweat. Welcome to the world of sleeping in armor, not the most common bedtime routine, but a very real necessity for some medieval soldiers. Because, in a land of sieges, ambushes, and betrayal, sometimes the safest way to rest was to stay battle-ready, even in your dreams. Let's be clear, no one wanted to sleep in full armor. Knights and soldiers didn't cozy up in complete plate mail by choice. Armor was heavy, loud, and hot. Chainmail snagged on bedding, and plate armor pinched the skin if you shifted wrong. Lying flat in it was nearly impossible, and rolling over felt like a slow-motion duel with gravity. But in dangerous times, like while marching across enemy territory or defending a castle under siege, sleep wasn't about comfort. It was about being able to stand and fight before your enemy kicked in the door. In many cases, soldiers would remove just their helmet and gauntlets, keeping their breastplate or mail shirt on through the night. That way, if battle came calling, they were already halfway suited. Weapons were never far. A sword or axe rested beside the bedroll. A shield might double as a pillow, one eye open, or at least one hand on the hilt. During campaigns, armies often slept outdoors or in makeshift camps. The ground was their bed, the stars their ceiling. Armor wasn't just protection from enemies. It was insulation against the elements. Cold, wind, damp earth, and creeping threats were constant. Sleeping partially armored meant you were never caught off guard. It also meant waking up, sore, stiff, and slightly miserable, but alive. Inside castles or garrisons, men-at-arms sometimes slept in light gear called gambesons, thick, padded jackets worn under armor. They were quilted, surprisingly effective at blocking blades, and marginally more comfortable than steel. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of sleeping in a bulletproof bathrobe. Not luxurious, but better than being vulnerable. For guards, sleep was broken into shifts. You never slept deeply, and rarely for long. Night watch meant taking turns, resting, and patrolling. It also meant that if an alarm sounded, a trumpet, a bell, or the dreaded war horn, everyone scrambled to their feet, armor rattling, adrenaline rushing. Imagine trying to buckle on greaves while half asleep, knowing invaders might already be scaling the walls. Even traveling merchants or important messengers sometimes slept in light protective gear when crossing dangerous areas. A padded tunic, a dagger at the waist, and nerves tuned to the sound of snapping twigs. But armor didn't just make you safer, it made you louder. One wrong movement, and you'd wake up your entire unit. That sudden metallic clang in the middle of the night, not a ghost, just Sir Geoffrey rolling over. Next, we delve into something even more surreal, sleepwalking in the medieval mind, because wandering through your cottage in the dark wasn't just awkward, it was considered a sign of possession, madness, or divine messages gone dangerously sideways. In the modern world, sleepwalking is filed somewhere between harmless and mildly embarrassing. Something you laugh about over breakfast. But in the medieval world, it was terrifying. If you stood up in the middle of the night, eyes vacant, they assumed you were bewitched, possessed, or being visited by forces not of this world. Sleepwalking, or as medieval scholars preferred, noctambulation, was poorly understood and deeply feared. To rise from your straw bed in a trance, shuffle barefoot across a dark floor, and stare into nothingness was to mirror the behavior of the dead or the damned. It wasn't just weird, it was unnatural. If a sleepwalker began speaking in Latin, a language many common folk didn't understand, it was either considered miraculous or grounds for immediate exorcism. Villagers who witnessed a loved one sleepwalking often panicked, not knowing if they were supposed to pray, wake them, or tie them down. In some regions, families responded by chaining one leg of the sleepwalker to the bed frame or a sturdy chair, a crude but effective method of nighttime containment. Confusion and spiritual vulnerability. Others thought it was punishment for impure thoughts or unconfessed sins. Terrifying stories of villagers found wandering on ledges, standing at the top of barns, or reaching toward the moon as if drawn by invisible hands. Whether true or exaggerated, these tales led to changes in architecture. Windows were barred, doors were reinforced, beds were moved away from open flames and sharp tools. In rare cases, a sleepwalker who entered a church uninvited was seen as a spiritual medium, a conduit for divine messages. But more often, they were seen as dangerous, not because they meant harm, but because no one trusted what guided them. Was it a vision, a possession, a test? Whatever it was, people took no chances. Families prayed over beds, hung iron charms above the door, placed protective herbs under pillows. Sleep wasn't just a risk to your body, it was a gamble with your soul. Next, we'll tune in to the chaotic soundscape of the medieval night, because between church bells, thunder, livestock, and the occasional siege, silence was a myth, and people still somehow managed to fall asleep in the middle of it all. While today we rely on white noise machines, soft playlists, or the hum of a fan to lull us to sleep, medieval people had their own soundtrack, and it was much louder, much stranger, and entirely out of their control. If you've ever wondered how anyone could sleep through chaos, just ask someone from the 13th century. Their lullabies were bells, storms, animals, and sometimes war. Church bells were the heartbeat of medieval timekeeping. They rang for everything: sunrise, prayers, meals, curfews, births, deaths, marriages, emergencies, and hourly reminders that God was watching. Monasteries rang them through the night to call monks to matins. If you lived anywhere near a church, and most people did, your nights were punctuated by the deep, echoing clang of bronze over rooftops and through stone walls. Eventually, your brain just accepted it. The bell wasn't a disturbance. It was a bedtime chorus. Medieval houses were barely insulated. Thunderstorms weren't muffled, they were deafening. Wind howled through every crack in the thatch, rattled wooden shutters, and lifted roof tiles like loose scales. Rain drummed against everything: roofs, buckets, livestock, and occasionally your face if you were sleeping under a leak. Lightning was believed by many to be a divine warning, and thunder could make even hardened peasants sit up and cross themselves. But still, people slept. Livestock made their own contributions. Cows lowed in the darkness. Dogs barked at invisible threats. Chickens clucked, pigs snorted, and goats sometimes screamed. Yes, screamed. If you were a child trying to fall asleep between your parents, the family dog, and 3 squirming siblings. In rural areas, howling wolves might punctuate the night. In towns, you might hear carts rattling over cobblestones, drunks singing off-key, or guards calling out the hour. And in wartime, which, let's face it, was most of the time, the noises were even worse. Screams, shouts, distant horns, or the eerie silence of soldiers moving under cover of darkness. During sieges, sleep was stolen in snatches, in basements, beside weapons, or not at all. Even peace had its noises. Fireplaces crackled and popped, straw rustled with bugs or shifting bodies, floors creaked, walls sighed. Everything, it seemed, had something to say. And yet they slept, because exhaustion won. After days spent toiling in fields, tending children, praying, hauling water, and constantly surviving, sleep became non-negotiable. The human body, pushed to its limit, shut down whether the pigs were quiet or not. Next, we'll explore how some medieval people used sleep not just as recovery, but as escape from grief, illness, hunger, or fear of the apocalypse. Many turned to sleep as a kind of sacred surrender, a soft shield against a world that rarely paused. When the fields failed, when illness struck, or when grief clung like a wet cloak, sleep offered the only real relief. It was the one place where suffering could be forgotten, if only for a few hours, and where dreams, however strange, might offer something gentler than reality. Grief, in particular, pushed people into sleep. With medicine limited and life expectancy low, mourning was constant and not always loud. People didn't always wail or fall to pieces. Instead, many withdrew. They slept longer. They stayed in bed during daylight hours. Sometimes they refused to get up at all. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. In a time before counseling or antidepressants, sleep was the closest thing to healing. Hunger, too, made sleep a necessity. During lean winters or failed harvests, when bread was scarce and soup was mostly water, people slept to conserve energy. Children would be sent to bed early, not because they were misbehaving, but because there was no food and no better way to pass the time. The body slowed down, limbs heavy, minds dulled by exhaustion and emptiness. Sleep didn't fix hunger, but it helped people outlast it. Doctors, midwives, and herbalists advised patients to rest, not because they fully understood infection or immune systems, but because they saw patterns. Those who slept more often healed faster. Sleep was sacred in sickness, a time when the body might do its mysterious internal work, away from firewood, chopping, and sheep chasing. But for some, sleep became a ritualized retreat from the world. There were people, usually women, known to sleep for extended periods during times of intense spiritual devotion or emotional collapse. Records mention women who slept nearly around the clock, waking only to pray or sip water. These were not always considered illnesses. Sometimes it was seen as a form of divine withdrawal, an effort to separate the soul from earthly pain. Others believed sleep was a portal, a place to connect with lost loved ones, to hear divine messages, or to receive comfort that waking life refused to provide. Dreams were visited, analyzed, and remembered, not for entertainment, but for meaning. A peaceful dream might be the only peaceful moment someone had all week. Of course, not all saw sleep as salvation. In some religious communities, extended sleep was frowned upon. Too much rest was seen as sloth, a cardinal sin. But even the harshest abbots knew that sometimes letting someone stay in bed a little longer wasn't weakness, it was mercy. In the next chapter, we'll peer into the curious world of second sleep, a now-forgotten rhythm of slumber that shaped the medieval night. Because back then, people didn't sleep in one long stretch. They woke up halfway through. And what they did during that quiet in-between time is stranger than fiction. Today, we think of sleep as a solid, unbroken stretch, ideally 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted rest. But in the medieval world, people didn't sleep like that. Their nights were divided not by accident, but by design. They had what's now called segmented sleep, 2 separate periods of rest. Well, it tells us a lot about how they lived, thought, and dreamed. The first sleep, or dead sleep, usually began shortly after nightfall. In a world without electric light and limited candles, darkness was reason enough to lie down. People fell asleep early, sometimes as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, wrapped in cloaks, curled under wool, or tucked beside family members and livestock. Then, sometime around midnight or a little after, they would wake not fully alert, not panicked, just naturally, as though stirred by some invisible rhythm. This wasn't insomnia, it was expected. People called it the watch, or simply the waking. It was quiet time, calm, dim, contemplative. And what did they do with it? Quite a lot, actually. Some people prayed. It was the perfect moment for whispered devotions or silent reflection, especially for those who couldn't attend church or afford religious books. Others used the time for intimacy. Manuals from the period even recommended the space between first and second sleep as the ideal time for marital relations. The body was rested, the house was still, and there were fewer interruptions from pigs or parish bells. Still others used the watch for work. They'd stoke the fire, mend clothing, prepare food, or check on livestock. Farmers might get a head start on chores. Bakers rose to begin their ovens. Even writers and monks used the stillness to read, write, or copy texts. It was a time suspended between day and night, work and rest. Some people simply sat by the hearth, talked in hushed tones, or reflected on dreams from their first sleep. It was a moment for storytelling, small decisions, or simply stretching one's legs before returning to slumber. After an hour or two, the second sleep would begin. This was often lighter, filled with more dreams, easier waking, and a gradual easing into dawn. People would rise at daybreak, feeling they had fully rested, even if they'd been awake in the middle of the night. In fact, this segmented sleep was so common that many medieval texts referred to first sleep and second sleep as ordinary phrases. like breakfast or sunset. This natural rhythm began to fade with the spread of artificial lighting. Gas lamps, and later electricity, pushed people toward consolidated sleep. The night no longer forced stillness, but in the medieval mind, that quiet gap between sleeps wasn't a problem. It was a gift, a gentle pause in a life that rarely allowed one. Next, we'll wander into the bedroom of a medieval noble, a space filled with feather beds, embroidered sheets, and privacy most peasants could only dream of. But even there, comfort came at a price. And luxury didn't always mean a better night's sleep. One that seems softer, grander, and far removed from pigs by the hearth or monks on stone benches. Here, high above the muddy streets, nobles slept on raised wooden platforms, nestled in feather beds, surrounded by tapestries, and, in many cases, enclosed in a curtained canopy. It sounds luxurious, and compared to a straw-stuffed sack on the floor, it absolutely was. But even among the elite, sleep wasn't always restful. In fact, sometimes the trappings of wealth brought their own peculiar discomforts. First, the beds. A noble's bed was often the most expensive piece of furniture in the home. The frames were carved from oak or walnut, heavy and ornate. They were raised off the ground, partly to display status, but also to escape drafts, rodents, and the ever-curious household dog. The mattress was layered, a straw or rope base, topped with a softer feather-stuffed tick, then covered in linen or woolen sheets, and maybe a fur or brocade blanket. All of it was protected by curtains, which hung from the canopy above and were drawn closed at night. The curtains weren't just for show. They served a practical purpose, blocking out cold, keeping out insects, and offering a rare sliver of privacy in a world where most people lived communally. In some castles, servants and guards still slept nearby, but the bed curtains created a sense of seclusion. They also trapped heat and smells. Between the lack of bathing, the heavy textiles, and the occasional chamber pot in the corner, the noble's bedchamber could quickly become a heady mix of perfume and perspiration. Clothing in bed was complicated. Nobles didn't sleep naked. That was considered improper, even shameful. Instead, they wore nightgowns, tunics, or undergarments. Some women even kept their hair wrapped and jewelry on in case they were visited unexpectedly. Nightcaps were common, not for fashion, but for warmth. Heat was a rare commodity in a drafty stone castle, and no one wanted to wake up with frozen ears. But comfort didn't guarantee sleep. Nobles had worries too, perhaps even more so than peasants. Political intrigue, land disputes, threats of betrayal, the pressure to produce heirs. These anxieties didn't stop at sundown. And there were superstitions. Dreams were scrutinized for omens. Bad dreams might require confession. Some nobles kept religious relics near their beds to ward off evil. Others relied on amulets, holy water, or charms sewn into their pillows. Noise was another issue. Though higher walls muted the sounds of livestock or street vendors, castles echoed in strange ways. A cry from the courtyard, a clang from the kitchens, or footsteps on stone could reverberate through halls and interrupt even the deepest sleep. Add to that the occasional midnight visitor, a messenger, a physician, or in rare cases, an assassin, and noble sleep was not always secure. So while the featherbed and silk sheets painted a picture of privilege, sleep in the noble class was still a fragile, interrupted thing. The body might have been cradled in comfort, but the mind often wandered corridors more troubling than any draft or creaking floorboard. Next, we journey back to the peasant's cottage, where dreams weren't luxuries but communal experiences. Because in homes where privacy didn't exist, everyone knew what and who you dreamed about, and that could be a blessing or a scandal. In a medieval peasant's home, dreams weren't whispered secrets, they were public events. In cottages, where entire families, sometimes 3 generations, slept in a single room, dreams became a communal affair. You couldn't hide your tossing, your mumbling, your sudden starts. If you cried out, someone heard. If you called a name, someone remembered. Sleep wasn't just shared in space, it was shared in spirit, and dreams, in that world, carried weight. Medieval people didn't treat dreams like random flickers of the brain. They believed dreams were messages from God, from the devil, from saints or demons, or even from the restless dead. A good dream could be a sign of favor, a bad one, a warning. Entire books were written to decode them. Dream manuals that explained what it meant to see a horse, a fish, a burning house, or a flying priest. These weren't entertainment guides, they were survival tools. So when someone spoke in their sleep or thrashed in fear, it didn't go unnoticed. Parents paid attention to their children's nightmares. Spouses listened to muttered confessions. Even neighbors, sleeping just a few feet away, might wake and interpret your restless night as a sign or a scandal. If you dreamed of someone inappropriate and murmured their name aloud, there were consequences. Jealousy, accusations, even punishments could follow. It wasn't just what you did in the daylight that mattered. Your nighttime mind was on display, whether you liked it or not. Privacy didn't exist. The darkness offered no protection from judgment. Some dreams were treated with reverence. Visions of saints or of radiant light were often reported to local priests. In rare cases, dreams sparked pilgrimages or changed lives. A farmer might believe he'd been told where to find a lost relic, or a mother might receive guidance for a sick child. These stories were shared, believed, and woven into local lore. But darker dreams carried danger. Dreaming of death, disease, or fire could be seen as a premonition, and that made people anxious. A man who dreamed repeatedly of drowning might avoid rivers for weeks. A woman who saw her child fall ill in a dream might call a priest before breakfast. It wasn't superstition, it was caution. Children, especially, were believed to be more open to supernatural dreams. Their innocence, people thought, made them more sensitive to messages from the otherworldly. Parents sometimes questioned them each morning, asking what they saw while asleep. A dream of a black dog or a weeping woman might set the tone for the entire day. Dreams could even change status. A man who claimed he'd seen a vision of Christ or the Virgin Mary might be treated with new respect or suspicion. Some were dismissed as drunk or delusional. Others were embraced as holy dreamers. But either way, a dream was never just a dream. In the next scene, we'll take a breath and explore one of the most unusual sleep companions of the medieval world, the sleep saint. Because if you feared nightmares, possession, or a visit from something far worse, you might just tuck a sacred relic into bed beside you. If the medieval world taught people anything, it was that sleep could be a dangerous business. Not just physically, not just the bugs, the cold, the loud monks, or screaming goats, but spiritually. The moment you closed your eyes, you were vulnerable. Vulnerable to bad dreams, to demonic temptation, to wandering spirits, or even death. So what did people do? They called on protection. And for many, that meant inviting a saint into bed with them, literally. Welcome to the curious world of the sleep saint. These weren't metaphorical companions. In many homes, especially among the devout people, slept with small relics of saints tucked beneath their pillows or tied around their necks. A splinter of wood, a fragment of bone, a piece of cloth that had touched a holy site. These weren't decoration, they were shields, protection from nightmares, from temptation, from sleep paralysis, and from anything unholy that might try to slip through while the soul was wandering. Some people had lockets or carved wooden boxes that held bits of scripture or tiny crucifixes meant specifically for nighttime use. Others, particularly in monastic or noble settings, might keep a full reliquary nearby, often placed beside the bed like a nightlight for the soul. In rare cases, pilgrims returning from Rome or Jerusalem brought back holy dust or water from sacred wells, believing it could ward off nocturnal evil. The choice of saint mattered. Saint Michael was popular for protection against demons. Saint Benedict was known to guard against poison and temptation. Saint Apollonia helped with nightmares and toothaches. If you feared death in the night, and many did, you might call on Saint Joseph, patron of a peaceful passing. People recited prayers before sleep, not just for rest, but for safety. They believed the right words, spoken sincerely, might keep their soul intact through the vulnerable, dark hours. Even children weren't left unprotected. Parents pinned charms to their nightshirts or hung small icons above cradles. Some families burned incense or placed blessed herbs, like rosemary or rue, beneath the mattress, just to be sure. And in times of plague or unrest, people doubled down. Whole households might sleep in one room, clutching their relics like armor, whispering prayers until they drifted into uneasy dreams. To modern minds, this sounds dramatic. But in a world where medicine was guesswork and spiritual danger felt as real as a broken roof, these rituals were lifelines. Sleep wasn't just a pause in the day, it was a crossing. And you didn't make that journey without divine backup. Next, we step into the secret life of the medieval midwife and the strange, often whispered stories of what she saw during nighttime births. Because in the hush of midnight labor, between candlelight and cries, sleep and wakefulness blurred into something almost otherworldly. In the flickering glow of a rushlight, when the rest of the village slept and the air was thick with silence, the midwife worked. She wasn't just delivering babies. She was navigating a sacred threshold between life and death, dream and waking, darkness and dawn. And most of her work happened at night, because medieval births, like everything else in that era, refused to stick to a schedule. Midwives were among the few people routinely awake while the rest of the world slumbered. When a woman went into labor, whether in a peasant's cottage or a noble's private chamber, someone would be sent running. The midwife, often half-dressed, would grab her bag of herbs, towels, oils, and charms, and walk into the dark. Sometimes she was summoned in a snowstorm, sometimes during a siege. Always, she came. These women weren't just caregivers. They were guardians of sleep's most fragile edges. They witnessed things others never saw. Mothers drifting in and out of consciousness, whispering dreams between contractions. Newborns arriving just as church bells struck matins. Fathers pacing in shadows, murmuring prayers to saints they hadn't spoken to in years. A nighttime birth blurred the line between reality and the unseen. Flickering candles threw shadows on walls, moans mixed with whispered blessings. In some traditions, women in labor were believed to be especially vulnerable to spiritual attack. The devil, some said, sought to claim mother or child during the birth. To counter this, midwives might place iron near the bed, burn protective herbs, or recite specific prayers. Some even drew holy symbols with ash or chalk on the doorframe, a warning to anything uninvited. Sleep came in strange forms during these nights. A laboring woman might pass out between contractions. Midwives snatched moments of rest curled on the floor, heads against the wall. Older children slept nearby, trying not to wake from the noise. The baby, once delivered, might fall into a soft, instinctive slumber that felt almost divine. It was a sleep born from chaos and utterly pure. For the midwife, the night didn't end when the child was born. She stayed to wash the mother, bless the baby, and tend to the afterbirth, a task viewed with both practical and spiritual importance. Some believed the placenta must be buried quickly and in a sacred spot to protect the child from harm. Others feared if it was burned or discarded improperly, the baby's soul might wander restlessly in sleep for the rest of its life. In towns and cities, midwives sometimes passed each other in the pre-dawn light, one returning from a birth, another headed toward one. Their faces were tired, their hands calloused, but they carried stories most people never heard. They held memories of mothers who whispered prayers to the Virgin between screams, of babies born during eclipses, of families who wept with joy, or not at all. Next, we'll wander through the winding superstition of sleep paralysis. That terrifying moment when you're awake but cannot move. And in the medieval mind, it meant only one thing: a demon was sitting on your chest. You wake in the dark, the room is still, but something feels wrong. Your eyes are open, you can see the flicker of the hearth's last embers, but your body won't move. Your arms, your legs, even your voice, frozen, and then the weight, heavy, pressing, as though something or someone is sitting right on your chest, watching, waiting. In the medieval world, this wasn't called sleep paralysis. It was called a visitation. Across Europe, the experience was well known and deeply feared. People believed that when you were caught between sleep and waking, hovering in that vulnerable twilight, evil things could find you, and not just evil thoughts. Real beings, witches, ghosts, demons, or nightmare spirits. In Germany, they called it the Alp. In Scandinavia, the Mara. In England, it was sometimes the old hag. All versions had something in common: a crushing, invisible presence that stole your breath and paralyzed your limbs. It wasn't a dream. It was a nocturnal assault. For many, the belief was literal. Something had entered the room, climbed onto the bed, sat on the chest, and you couldn't cry out. That silence, that helplessness, it was proof. A spiritual invasion, a warning, or even a punishment. Artists painted it, writers described it. In the 18th century, long after the medieval period, Henry Fuseli would immortalize it in his famous painting, The Nightmare. A woman limp in sleep, a demon crouched atop her ribs, but the terror was much older. To ward it off, people tried everything. Iron was the first defense, a nail under the pillow, a key by the bedpost, or even sleeping with a blade nearby. Crucifixes were common, as were herbs like mugwort and St. John's wort, believed to repel evil spirits. Some hung garlic or onions by the bed. Others drew protective circles on the floor, or whispered psalms before sleep, not just to rest well, but to survive the night. It wasn't just peasants who feared the night hag. Nobles, monks, even kings confessed to night oppressions. For some, it became a religious crisis, proof that the soul was under attack. Confession might follow, or fasting, or the burning of old bedsheets suspected to harbor unclean energy. And there was a social cost. If a woman claimed to be plagued by nightly visitations, neighbors might whisper that she was cursed, or worse, possessed. A man who suffered frequent paralysis might be suspected of sin, or of attracting unclean spirits with impure thoughts. The line between sleep disorder and spiritual danger was paper-thin. Science now tells us sleep paralysis is natural, a misfiring between REM cycles and consciousness. But to the medieval sleeper, lying frozen in the dark, it was proof that the night was alive, and it wanted something. Next, we'll travel to the medieval inn, where sleep wasn't just shared, it was negotiated. Between drunken pilgrims, snoring strangers, and lice-ridden bedding, a good night's sleep was something you hoped for, but rarely got. Step into a medieval inn, and forget everything you know about private rooms, quiet nights, or complimentary breakfast. These places weren't cozy roadside sanctuaries, they were chaotic, crowded, and often teetering on the edge of mayhem. Sleep wasn't guaranteed, it was earned, or at least negotiated through noise, smells, and the occasional brawl. Inns served travelers of all kinds, merchants hauling goods, pilgrims on holy journeys, messengers with royal seals, and peasants with nowhere else to go. Lodging varied wildly. A wealthy knight might afford a private chamber, drafty, dim, and furnished with a lumpy mattress. But most guests, they slept together, literally, in long halls, side by side, on pallets, benches, or even straw-strewn floors. Forget asking for extra pillows. You were lucky if the hay didn't squirm. Beds were shared between strangers. You could end up between a fisherman who snored like a thunderstorm and a peddler who talked in his sleep. If you were small, you might wake up spooned between two large, sweating bodies, each dreaming their own chaotic dreams. And yes, lice and fleas came standard. Noise was constant. Men laughed too loudly over ale. Someone was always coughing. A bard might play into the night, or worse, rehearse, and above it all, snoring. Medieval accounts describe the chorus of sleep sounds in communal inns as beasts in the dark. They weren't far off. Privacy was non-existent. If you rolled over and muttered something in your sleep, everyone heard it. If you dreamed of your lover and cried their name, it became tomorrow's gossip. Some inns had wooden partitions, but most travelers accepted that sleep came with company, and the price of lodging was the loss of personal space. And yet, inns were essential. For the exhausted traveler, even a noisy floor was better than the dangers of sleeping outdoors, wolves, robbers, or freezing winds. The inn, for all its discomfort, had walls, warmth, and at least a sliver of security. To cope, many carried sleep aids, herbs wrapped in cloth to tuck under the nose, wax balls to plug the ears, or a flask of mead to drink just enough to pass out quickly. Some travelers prayed before bed, not for dreams, but for unconsciousness. A deep, dreamless sleep was a blessing. 1 hour without interruption felt like a miracle. Innkeepers didn't always provide blankets. You brought your own if you were smart. And if you were smarter, you tied your valuables to your belt while you slept. Thieves didn't wait for daylight. Despite all this, stories flourished in inns. Tales were shared, songs were sung, news traveled. The inn was a social node, part bedroom, part tavern, part stage. You might not sleep well, but you'd leave with stories. Next, we enter the cloistered silence of the monastery, where sleep wasn't a luxury, but a discipline. For monks, Rest came in short, regimented bursts, because when your life revolves around God, even your dreams must obey the bell. Inside the stone walls of a medieval monastery, sleep wasn't something to indulge in. It was something to regulate, restrict, and sometimes resist altogether. For monks, rest was not about comfort. It was a sacred pause in a life of relentless devotion, and every moment asleep was a moment surrendered not to the self, but to God. There were no plush beds, no warm hearths, only hard cells, cold floors, and a rhythm shaped entirely by bells. Monastic life revolved around the divine office, a schedule of prayers that broke the day into strict segments. The bell rang for matins, often between midnight and 2 a.m., waking the brothers for their first communal prayer. In silence, they'd rise from their straw pallets or wooden planks, wrap themselves in robes, and file into the chapel like shadows in the candlelight. Their chants rose into the cold air, slow, deep, resonant. It wasn't just worship, it was a kind of spiritual sleepwalking, holy and hypnotic. After matins came a brief return to sleep, perhaps an hour or two. Then lauds at dawn, followed by a full day of work, reading, and prayer. Meals were sparse, talking was limited, and distractions were discouraged. When night finally returned, rest came again, but in short, controlled doses. Most monks slept 4 to 6 hours in total, broken into segments. Some slept fully clothed, ready to rise at the bell. Their cells were often shared dormitories, lined with simple pallets or mats. Blankets were thin. Pillows, if allowed, were made of straw. Silence was absolute, not just to maintain order, but to keep thoughts pure. Dreams, in this world, were treated with suspicion. Visions of angels or saints might be accepted cautiously, but erotic dreams, nightmares, or excessive drowsiness were seen as spiritual weaknesses, even temptations. Monks were taught to examine their dreams for signs of pride, lust, or demonic interference. Some fasted or prayed extra hours to atone for unsettling images they couldn't even control. Sleepwalking monks were rare, but when it happened, it caused alarm. If a brother wandered at night, eyes unfocused, muttering Latin or gesturing wildly, it could be interpreted as possession, divine visitation, or a sign of illness. In extreme cases, the abbot might order confinement, exorcism, or fasting. Some monks embraced even stricter practices, sleeping on bare floors, using stones for pillows, or rising multiple times per night to pray alone in the dark. These weren't just personal habits, they were acts of penance, meant to discipline the body and focus the soul. And yet, even in this austere world, sleep was not entirely denied. It was granted sparingly, reverently, and with structure. Because to serve God fully, the body needed rest, just not too much of it. In the next scene, we slip into the surreal world of prophetic dreams, when sleep became a bridge to the divine, and visions seen in the night could shape the fate of kings, saints, and entire nations. In the medieval imagination, dreams weren't just flickers of the subconscious, they were dispatches from beyond. To sleep was to open a window to the sacred, the symbolic, or the sinister. And some dreams, it was believed, didn't come from within at all. They came from God, or from the devil, or from realms in between. These were prophetic dreams, powerful, unsettling, sometimes beautiful, and they were taken very seriously. There are records of dreams that changed the course of lives. Kings claimed to receive divine warnings in their sleep, visions of battle, betrayal, or death. Clergy spoke of dreams filled with flaming swords, bleeding icons, or saints speaking in riddles. Peasants, too, told of dreams in which they were lifted above the clouds, or visited by radiant figures who whispered secrets. In all classes of society, dreams could carry weight. One of the most famous dreamers of the medieval world was Saint Perpetua, a Christian martyr from the 3rd century, whose prison visions were recorded in vivid detail, dreams of ladders to heaven, of battle with demons, of divine nourishment. Her dreams were preserved, copied, and treated as sacred texts, proof that sleep could become a stage for salvation. Dreams were often interpreted through books, dream manuals that translated symbols into meanings. Dreaming of water might mean change. Fire could mean purification or danger. A crown might mean promotion or pride. These books were read by scholars and laypeople alike, used like dictionaries for decoding the messages of the night. But not all prophetic dreams were gentle. Some came as nightmares, thick with blood or shadows. These were seen as warnings, not to be ignored. A noble who dreamed of his own death might fast the next day or consult a priest. A bishop who saw a city in flames might write letters to warn of plague or rebellion. These weren't bedtime stories, they were potential prophecies. The church tread carefully. It accepted that God could speak through dreams. The Bible, after all, is full of dreamers. Joseph of Egypt, Daniel, even the Magi received guidance in sleep. But the church also warned that the devil could mimic divine dreams. Just because a vision was powerful didn't mean it was pure. Discernment was required. That meant prayer, confession, and often the approval of a priest. Some medieval people claimed recurring dreams, the same image or scene, over and over. These were considered especially potent. They were pursued, studied, sometimes even acted upon. A recurring dream might lead someone to join a monastery, start a pilgrimage, or dig in a field where treasure was seen. Dreams could also spread. One person's vision might spark a movement. Stories tell of peasants who dreamed of saints, instructing them to build chapels, and when they did, miracles followed. Whether those miracles were real, symbolic, or invented after the fact didn't matter. The dream gave people purpose. Next, we'll descend into the fearful heart of the medieval nightmare, where the lines between fear, punishment, and possession blurred, and where waking from a dream didn't always mean the danger was over. Medieval nightmares were not just a product of troubled minds. They were believed to be a window into the deepest terrors of the human soul, sometimes visited by demons, or even the devil himself. In a world where the supernatural was ever present, these dark dreams could bring warnings of impending doom, sinful behavior, or even the punishment awaiting sinners in the afterlife. For those who experienced them, they were often seen as signs to be reckoned with, urging immediate action. One of the most disturbing and common nightmares of the time involved being chased or attacked by monstrous figures, perhaps a great beast, a demonic force, or even a spectral knight. These creatures symbolized not only death, but the existential threat of damnation. Many medieval people believed that being attacked in a dream was the devil's way of threatening the soul, trying to shake their faith and weaken their resolve to live a virtuous life. Often, these nightmares would be followed by periods of extreme anxiety, guilt, and the overwhelming need for prayer and penance. Another common nightmare involved dreams of falling, a sensation that translated to the medieval mind as a deep spiritual crisis. Falling could be interpreted as a metaphor for spiritual decline or the loss of grace. It symbolized a soul in peril, hurtling towards eternal damnation. Waking from such a nightmare was a call for reflection, repentance, and a desperate effort to find salvation. The belief was that if you dreamed of falling and did not act accordingly, your soul would continue its descent, both in the dream world and the real one. The experience of sleep paralysis, a condition where the body wakes up before the mind, leaving the person temporarily immobile, was often explained as being visited by nightmarish entities. These creatures, sometimes described as witches or dark spirits, would sit on the chest of the victim, preventing them from moving or breathing. The sensation of suffocation during sleep paralysis was tied directly to the fear of possession or spiritual oppression. People would wake from these nightmares, often drenched in sweat, feeling as if they had fought off a true and terrifying enemy. In some accounts, these night terrors were described as demonic encounters, where the soul was literally under siege. The medieval church was both a sanctuary and an arbiter of dreams. It played a pivotal role in the interpretation of these powerful nocturnal visits. Priests would often be consulted to help the troubled dreamer understand the significance of their terrifying experiences. Were these dreams a divine warning, or had the devil made a special visit? In many cases, the church was quick to offer spiritual guidance. Prayers, masses, and even exorcisms were common remedies to cleanse the soul of demonic influences. Nightmares were not confined to the individuals who experienced them. Entire communities might share similar dreams, especially during times of social unrest or plague. It was not uncommon for a shared dream of a terrible disaster to spread throughout a village, creating a collective sense of impending doom. These dreams could spark mass pilgrimages, collective prayers, or even societal shifts, all motivated by the fear that the entire community was under threat. As the night wore on, these nightmares would give way to restless, fitful slumbers, filled with the restless murmurings of troubled souls caught between the earthly and the spiritual realms. And for some, the waking from such dreams did not signal a return to safety, but rather the beginning of a long and harrowing journey to make sense of what had been seen and what had been foretold. Next, we will explore the spiritual practices that medieval people relied upon to protect themselves from these dangerous dreams, turning to the holy and the sacred to ward off the terrors of the night. In the medieval world, sleep was not left to chance. To protect themselves from nightmares, demonic visitations, and restless spirits, people turned to spiritual practices rooted in faith, fear, and centuries of tradition. Before bed, sleep wasn't simply a matter of lying down. It was a ritual, a preparation of the soul as much as the body. Because in the eyes of the medieval mind, nighttime was a battlefield, and every sleeper was a soldier in need of armor. Evening prayers were the first line of defense. These were recited not out of habit, but out of necessity. The Compline, the final canonical hour of the day, was a structured, communal prayer said by monks, nuns, and devout lay people alike. It included psalms that asked for protection through the night, invoking angels, saints, and God Himself to watch over the sleeper. One of the most commonly quoted lines, "Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep." It wasn't poetry, it was a plea. Some families went further, sprinkling holy water around the bed before sleep. This practice was especially common during times of illness, after funerals, or during periods of spiritual unrest. It was thought to purify the room and drive out any lingering evil. In wealthier homes, the water was kept in finely carved stone fonts mounted near the bed, a spiritual nightlight. Amulets and charms were also popular, often embroidered into pillows or hung from bedposts. These might include small crosses, carved relics, or inscribed prayers written on parchment and tucked under mattresses. Some people wore rosaries or scapulars around their necks, even in sleep, believing they offered continuous protection through the vulnerable hours of slumber. Sleep positioning could also carry spiritual meaning. Some preferred to lie on their right side, the side believed to be associated with goodness and divine favor. Sleeping on the left, in contrast, was sometimes discouraged, as it was linked to darkness, temptation, and even association with the devil in certain traditions. The body, even at rest, was a vessel of spiritual significance. In particularly devout households, bedtime might include reading from a psalter or repeating a litany of saints. Parents often encouraged children to memorize specific prayers for protection, not unlike modern children asking for guardian angels to watch over them. Pilgrims and travelers, especially those staying in unfamiliar inns or roadside shelters, carried small relics or blessed tokens for nightly use. A tiny scrap of cloth from a saint's cloak, a pebble from a holy spring, a bit of wax from a candle lit in a cathedral. These items were placed beneath pillows or held in hand during sleep. It was a way of bringing a piece of sacred space into an uncertain night. For monks and nuns, spiritual discipline continued even in dreams. They were taught to be mindful of their thoughts at the edge of sleep, to meditate on Christ's passion or the lives of saints. Dreams, after all, could be influenced by what the mind held before drifting off. A virtuous thought at bedtime, it was believed, could shield the dreamer from temptation. In the next chapter, we'll examine how death itself was seen as a kind of eternal sleep, and how the rituals surrounding burial, prayer, and the afterlife reflected a hope that in dying, the soul would find its final, peaceful rest and not be disturbed again. To die in the Middle Ages was, in many ways, to fall asleep forever. Death was often called the long sleep, and the language surrounding it reflected this idea: a final rest, a quiet slumber, a departure into peace. But just like ordinary sleep, this eternal rest came with rituals, fears, and the ever-present hope that the soul would not be disturbed after its departure. Because for medieval people, what happened after you closed your eyes for the last time was just as important, perhaps even more so, than what happened in life. The rituals surrounding death were detailed and sacred. A person on the verge of dying was said to be falling asleep in the Lord. If there was time, a priest would be called to administer the last rites confession, anointing with holy oil, and the Eucharist, all meant to prepare the soul for its journey. These rites weren't just for comfort, they were armor for the passage through purgatory, that shadowy, painful space between this life and paradise. The body was washed and dressed with reverence, often in a simple shroud or the person's best clothing. Eyes were closed, hands were folded over the chest, and a candle was placed near the head, symbolic of the soul's light still glowing on its journey. But this wasn't just for symbolism. That candle was believed to ward off demons who might try to snatch the soul during its first uncertain hours outside the body. Sleeping in death didn't mean stillness. There were fears, real, deep fears, that the soul could wander, that it could be trapped in purgatory or even return. that if the proper prayers weren't said, if the burial wasn't done right, the dead might not rest peacefully. Ghosts, in medieval belief, weren't rare. They were restless. They came back to ask for prayers, to complete unfinished tasks, or to seek justice for wrongs done in life. People believed in good deaths and bad deaths. A good death came quietly, with time to prepare, confess, and be surrounded by loved ones. A bad death, sudden, violent, alone, left the soul unready and exposed. It might mean centuries in purgatory or worse. Sleep, in this eternal sense, wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned and prayed for and protected. Churchyards and burial sites were places of both peace and anxiety. People visited graves to offer prayers, leave food, or light candles. They didn't think of the dead as gone, but as sleeping nearby, waiting for resurrection. Tombs often had inscriptions, like "Here lies," or "He sleeps beneath this stone." It wasn't just poetic, it was a statement of faith, that death wasn't the end, just a pause. Some even feared being buried alive, a nightmare that took the metaphor to literally. Stories circulated of people mistakenly entombed, only to awaken within their coffins. It's unclear how often this actually happened, but the fear was real enough that some were buried with bells or breathing tubes, just in case. For those left behind, the line between life and eternal sleep was sometimes terrifyingly thin. In our final chapter, we return to the living world, to the sounds, smells, and strange habits that made sleep in the Middle Ages such a bizarre, fascinating, and deeply human experience. Because for all the saints and spirits, monks and nightmares, medieval people, like us, just wanted to rest. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was layered with fear, with ritual, with meaning. But beneath all the sacred relics and whispered prayers, beyond the snoring inns and cloistered monasteries, there was something universal, the longing for rest, a soft moment at the end of a hard day, a break from the toil, the grief, the cold. In the quiet hours of night, medieval people, kings and peasants alike, sought the same thing we do now: peace. The sounds of medieval sleep were many. In a rural cottage, you might hear the low breath of livestock in the next room, the creak of beams overhead, the wind pushing through gaps in the wall. In a town, you'd hear the late-night clatter of a watchman's steps, the drunkard's song down an alley, or the bark of a dog unsettled by something unseen. Silence, true silence, was rare. Sleep came with background noise, and people got used to it. Smells were a constant companion. To beds of straw held the scent of sweat, wood smoke, and old herbs. In noble homes, sleeping chambers were perfumed with dried lavender or rosemary. In poorer ones, the scent of cabbage stew and damp earth might linger. A fire in the hearth provided warmth, light, and smoke, which clung to every blanket. It was all part of the atmosphere of medieval sleep, not pleasant necessarily, but deeply familiar. And yet, in this world of discomforts and oddities, people found ways to make sleep beautiful. Songs were sung before bed, lullabies passed from mother to child. Folk tales were told in low voices, often with warnings tucked inside. Don't sleep with your feet toward the door. Never whistle in your dreams. Leave bread for the spirits, or they'll visit you tonight. The bed itself held meaning. For a married couple, it was a place of union and legacy. Children were conceived, secrets were whispered, and sometimes goodbyes were said. Beds were heirlooms, often passed down through generations. In wealthier homes, canopies and curtains were added not just for warmth, but for privacy, symbolism, and pride. To be granted a bed of your own, even a humble one, was a small sign of dignity. There were superstitions, of course. Some believed you should never speak aloud to a person who was sleepwalking. It could trap their soul. Others thought you shouldn't wake someone during a nightmare, lest the spirit linger. There were fears of dreams that crossed into prophecy, of night creatures that whispered in your ear, and of places, old forests, crossroads, abandoned chapels, where no one should ever sleep. And yet, despite the fear, despite the flickering lights and restless dreams, sleep persisted. It stitched itself into the rhythm of daily life. It gave the poor a break from suffering, the sick a moment of peace, and the faithful a chance to draw closer to the divine. It was imperfect, but it was theirs. So, the next time you lie down in a warm bed with a soft pillow and a locked door, remember the strange, beautiful, and often uneasy sleep of those who came before. They walked into the same darkness, they closed their eyes with the same hopes, and though they lived in a world of saints, spirits, and shadowy fears, all they really wanted, like you, was to wake up safe, rested, and alive. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey into the night, don't forget to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes for more soft-spoken history, strange facts, and bedtime storytelling. May your dreams tonight be peaceful and utterly uneventful. Good night.